There is a kind of silence that only exists in courtrooms. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. It is the silence of finality. The silence of a door closing on something that can never be reopened. And on a cold Tuesday morning in February, in a municipal courthouse in Dayton, Ohio, a woman named Carol sat inside that silence and listened to the sound of her own life being divided into two separate columns on a piece of paper. 17 years. Reduced to signatures and line items and a judge's hollow stamp that echoed off the marble floors like the last word in an argument no one won. For 17 years, Carol Ann Mitchell had been half of something. A wife, a partner, a co-signer on a life she no longer recognized as her own. And then on that February morning, it was over. She walked out of that courthouse carrying nothing but a manila folder and the weight of a future she had no map for, no house, no savings account in her name. Just a signature and a new last name she hadn't decided whether to keep. Her friends would later say she seemed calm, almost eerily calm, like a woman who had already grieved the ending long before it arrived, and maybe she had. But what none of them knew, what Carol herself did not know, was that 7 days after she walked down those courthouse steps alone, her phone was going to ring. And the life she thought she had just lost, it was going to turn out to be nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what she was about to receive. A $750 million real estate empire, a father's final secret, a half-brother she barely knew, an ex-husband who hadn't left the country yet, and a family that was about to go to war over every single acre of it. This is the story of a woman who lost everything on a Tuesday and discovered on the following Tuesday that she had always owned more than anyone in her life had ever told her. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching this from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already hit that subscribe button, please do it now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because this one is going to stay with you for a very long time. Carol Ann Mitchell was not the kind of woman who ended up in documentaries. She was not a celebrity. She had never been photographed at a gala or quoted in a business magazine or invited to sit on a panel. She was a 43-year-old middle school English teacher from Dayton, Ohio, who drove a 2014 Honda Accord with a cracked passenger side mirror that she kept meaning to fix. She graded papers on Sunday evenings with a glass of sweet tea on the coffee table and a true crime podcast playing low in the background. She coached the after-school reading program on Thursdays. She brought store-bought cookies to every staff meeting because she genuinely liked the people she worked with. She was, by every external measure, a completely ordinary woman living a completely ordinary life. And that is precisely what makes what happened to her so extraordinary. Carol grew up in a small house on the east side of Dayton with her mother Patrice, a registered nurse who worked 12-hour shifts and came home smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. Carol's father, a man named Raymond Price, was not part of that picture. He had been present sporadically, unpredictably, during her earliest years. A birthday card here, a phone call there, a visit every couple of years that always felt more like a business obligation than a reunion. Carol learned very early not to wait by the window for him. She learned to build her world around the people who actually showed up. And so she did. She built a life held together by reliability and routine and the quiet, stubborn grace of a woman who had long since made peace with disappointment. She met her husband, Dennis Mitchell, in her late 20s at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in the summer. He was charming and ambitious, and he looked at her across a picnic table like she was the most interesting person in the room. For a woman who had spent most of her life feeling peripheral to the people who were supposed to love her most, that attention was intoxicating. They married in the fall of the following year. For the first several years, the marriage was genuinely good. They bought a modest 3-bedroom house. They talked about children, but never quite committed. They built a life that was comfortable, if not electric. But somewhere around year 9 or 10, something began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single explosion, no one devastating moment of betrayal. It was something slower and in many ways more devastating than that. A gradual, quiet withdrawal. Two people living side by side who had stopped truly seeing each other. Carol would describe it later to friends as feeling like they had been speaking different languages for years without ever acknowledging that the translation had broken down somewhere along the way. By the time Dennis finally said the word divorce, Carol told the people closest to her that she mostly felt relieved. Not broken, not blindsided, just released. Like a breath she had been holding for 5 years had finally been allowed to leave her body. She agreed terms that her attorney quietly begged her to reconsider. Dennis kept the house. They split what was left of a modest joint savings account. Carol took her car, her books, her grandmother's china, and a cat named Chester. She signed everything with a steady hand and walked out of the lawyer's office on a Thursday afternoon in January and thought to herself, now what? She had no idea. No idea that the answer to that question was already in motion. That the answer had been in motion for decades, in office buildings and land records and corporate filings spread across 5 states, in the careful and methodical hands of a man she barely knew. A man who, while Carol was building her ordinary life in Dayton, had been quietly building something extraordinary, something that would one day bear her name whether she wanted it to or not. Raymond Price was, by all accounts, what people in certain circles of the American South refer to as quietly rich. Not flashy, not public. He did not have his picture taken at ribbon cuttings or give interviews to Forbes or attend charity galas where the real purpose was visibility. He drove a sensible car. He ate lunch at the same diner in Atlanta every Tuesday and Thursday for 30 years. He tipped well and spoke softly and remembered the names of people's children. And over the course of 4 decades, through patience and precision and an almost preternatural instinct for undervalued land, he had assembled one of the most substantial private real estate portfolios in the American South. Office buildings in Atlanta and Charlotte, apartment complexes stretching from Tennessee to Texas, commercial properties in markets that nobody had paid attention to yet, until Raymond Price had already purchased them for a fraction of what they would eventually be worth. Storage facilities, industrial warehouses, mixed-use developments in mid-sized cities that were beginning to grow just fast enough to make the numbers work magnificently. At the time of his death, the independent valuation of his holdings came to $750 million. $750 million. Accumulated quietly. Held quietly. Never mentioned to his daughter. Never mentioned, as far as anyone could tell, to almost anyone outside of the small, tight circle of attorneys and accountants and property managers who had spent their careers helping him build it. Raymond Price had constructed something genuinely monumental, and he had done it in near total silence. The people who knew him well, or thought they did, would later struggle to explain it. Was it paranoia? Was it privacy? Was it the particular psychology of a man who had grown up with nothing and had never fully trusted that the wealth he accumulated was real enough to survive being spoken aloud? His longtime attorney, who worked with Raymond for over 25 years and who knew the structure of his estate better than almost anyone alive, would later say simply, Raymond believed that the moment people knew what you had, they stopped seeing you and started seeing your assets. He had spent his entire adult life making sure people saw him first. What Raymond had not done, or had not done effectively, was maintain any real relationship with his daughter. Carol knew he was alive. She knew he was somewhere in Atlanta. She knew he was involved in real estate in some capacity, because he had mentioned it vaguely on the few occasions they had spoken over the years. She did not know the scale. She did not know the scope, and she had long since stopped trying to understand a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of letting anyone truly close to him. She had learned to hold him at the same careful distance he had always held her. It was, she would later say, the only way to survive loving someone who kept the door perpetually half closed. What Carol did not know, what she would not learn until she was sitting in an Atlanta conference room with strangers who shared her blood, was that Raymond Price had been watching. From a distance. Always from a distance. He had known about the marriage to Dennis. He had known about the teaching career. He had known about the house in Dayton. Whether he had chosen his distance deliberately, whether he had told himself it was for her protection, whether he had convinced himself that staying away was somehow an act of love, that is a question that would haunt Carol for a very long time. And the answer, when it finally came, would arrive in a form she could never have anticipated. The divorce proceedings formally began in November. Carol and Dennis had separated several months before that, quietly and without spectacle, the way most long marriages end. Not with a door slamming, but with a door just never quite being opened again. Carol had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment 2 miles from the school where she taught. She had decorated it with plants and the good lamps and the grandmother's china she had insisted on taking, and she had done her best to make it feel like a beginning and not a retreat. Some days that worked better than others. The legal process itself was mercifully undramatic. Dennis was not cruel about it. Carol was not combative. Her attorney, a patient woman named Diane, who specialized in family law and had seen every variation of this particular kind of sadness, had encouraged Carol to push harder on certain provisions. The house had appreciated significantly in the years since they'd bought it. Carol's contributions to the household over 17 years had been substantial, both financially and otherwise. She had a legitimate case for more. But Carol had looked at the numbers on the table, made a calculation that was not purely financial. She wanted it over. She wanted clean. She wanted to walk out of that courtroom and feel like she was walking towards something rather than retreating from someone. And so she signed. She accepted the terms. She gave Dennis the house, took her half of the modest savings, and walked out of that February courthouse into the gray winter morning feeling, for the first time in years, like herself again. She had been free for exactly 7 days when Raymond Price died. She was grading papers, 7th-grade essays on a novel she had assigned about a girl who discovers her family has been keeping a secret, when her phone rang on a Wednesday evening. The number was unfamiliar, an Atlanta area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. But something made her answer, and the voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional, and introduced itself as belonging to a woman named Margaret Calloway, the senior partner at a law firm Carol had never heard of. Margaret said she was calling on behalf of the estate of Raymond Allen Price. She said Raymond had passed away 4 days earlier of cardiac arrest. She said there would be a reading of the will and that Carol's presence in Atlanta was required. She said Carol should bring an attorney if she had one. And then she said something that Carol would repeat to friends in the days that followed in a voice that still sounded faintly disbelieving. She said Carol should be prepared for the meeting to take some time. Carol sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and did not move for several minutes. She had not spoken to her father in nearly 3 years. The last time had been a brief, slightly awkward phone call on her birthday, during which Raymond had asked how she was doing, and she had said fine, and he had said good, and they had stayed on the line for an uncomfortable moment before finding a graceful way to say goodbye. She had known on some level that a call like this would come one day. She had thought about it abstractly, the way you think about abstractions you have never needed to make real. She had not thought about it like this. She had not thought about it as something that would happen in an Atlanta law office 11 days after her divorce was finalized, with her life already fully dismantled and awaiting reconstruction. She typed her father's name into a search engine for what she would later admit was the first time in years. The results loaded slowly, and then they did not load slowly enough. The first result was a brief business profile from a real estate trade publication dated 4 years earlier. It mentioned Raymond Price in the context of a commercial development deal in the Atlanta metro area, a mixed-use project valued at roughly $60 million. Carol stared at that number. Then she scrolled. There were property records, corporate entity filings, a brief mention in a regional business journal about a warehouse acquisition in Nashville, another mention in a Charlotte commercial real estate newsletter. The name Price Development Holdings kept appearing. She searched that name separately and found a corporate registration document that listed Raymond Allen Price as sole principal. She found a list of subsidiary entities that stretched the length of her phone screen. She sat at her kitchen table with Chester the cat on her lap and scrolled for 45 minutes and still could not find the bottom of it. She did not sleep that night. She drove to Atlanta the next morning. The city felt enormous and strange to her as she navigated toward the address Margaret Calloway had given her. She was not a woman who spent time in cities like this, in glass tower law offices with private elevator banks and conference rooms that looked out over skylines. She sat in the waiting area in the blazer she had bought for parent-teacher conferences and watched well-dressed people move through the lobby with the confidence of people who had never once in their lives felt out of place anywhere. She had packed the manila folder from the courthouse. She had brought her own attorney, a Dayton family lawyer named Brian who had handled her divorce and who was, Carol would later admit, somewhat unprepared for what was about to happen. Margaret Calloway was precise and warm and chose every word with the care of a surgeon. She showed Carol into the conference room, and Carol walked in and found herself looking at people she was related to by blood and almost nothing else. There were 4 other people in that conference room besides the attorneys. There was Marcus Price, Carol's half-brother, Raymond's son from his second marriage, who was 41 years old and who ran a mid-sized property management company in Atlanta that, Carol would later learn, operated largely within the shadow of their father's empire. There was Marcus's wife, a composed and watchful woman who had clearly been briefed extensively before the meeting. There was Raymond's sister, Carol's Aunt Patricia, who was 72 years old, and who regarded Carol across the conference table with an expression that could not quite decide between suspicion and curiosity. And there was Patricia's attorney, who had arrived with a leather briefcase and the particular posture of a man who had been hired to object to something. Carol had met Marcus twice in her adult life. Both meetings had been brief and obligatory and had not resulted in anything resembling a real relationship. She knew he existed. He knew she existed. That was approximately the full extent of it. She had never met Patricia at all. And sitting across from these strangers in a room that smelled of expensive coffee and clean carpet, Carol felt the particular loneliness of being on the outside of a family that technically included her. She was the outsider in her own father's story. She had always been the outsider. And she was not entirely sure why she had been invited to the center of it now, when Raymond was gone and could not explain himself. Margaret Calloway set a copy of the will in front of each person at the table. She cleared her throat. She began to read. The language was formal and dense, and Carol followed it with the concentration of a woman trying to translate something in a language she almost but did not quite speak. There were provisions for charitable contributions. There were detailed instructions about the management structure of Price Development Holdings. There were specific bequests for a small number of longtime employees. And then Margaret Calloway reached a passage near the end of the document, and she paused in the way that people pause when they know the next words are going to change the temperature of the room. She looked up from the document. She found Carol's face specifically, the way a compass finds north. And she read the words that Raymond Allen Price had dictated to her 18 months before his death. The entirety of the state, every property, every holding company, every subsidiary entity, every acre of undeveloped land, every commercial building, every apartment complex, every storage facility, all cash reserves, all investment accounts. The entirety of the estate was to pass, without division, to his daughter, Carol Ann Mitchell, formerly Carol Ann Price. The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds, and then everything happened at once. Marcus was on his feet before Margaret Calloway had finished the sentence. His wife's hand found his arm and he shook it off. Patricia's attorney was already opening his briefcase. Patricia herself sat very still, which was somehow more alarming than if she had stood. The room is filled with voices, overlapping, controlled but barely. The kind of voices that belong to people who are accustomed to getting what they want and have just been informed they are not going to get it. Carol sat in the center of all of it, completely motionless. She would later describe the moment as feeling like being in the eye of something. Not calm, exactly, not peaceful. Just strangely still while everything else moved. She had come to Atlanta not knowing what to expect. She had come to Atlanta still not fully processing that her father was gone, a man she had grieved in increments over decades, and was now being asked to grieve all at once in a conference room full of strangers who were angrier than she was. And in the middle of all of it, she was being told that Raymond Allen Price, the man who had never once made her feel fully chosen, had chosen her, completely, finally, irrevocably, and had left everyone else in that room to make whatever peace they could with that fact. Carol's attorney Brian sat beside her, taking notes with the focused intensity of a man who understood he was significantly out of his depth and was going to need to make several phone calls before the end of the day. Margaret Calloway continued reading over the noise with the composure of a woman who had managed difficult rooms before and had no intention of losing control of this one. Security was called. Not dramatically, just quietly requested, the way experienced attorneys handle escalation before it becomes a scene. Marcus and his wife were asked to wait in a separate room. Patricia's attorney filed a formal notation of intent to contest. And Carol sat in that conference room with a copy of her father's will in her hands and tried to comprehend the number $750 million in a way that her brain simply refused to process. She was 43 years old. She had a 2014 Honda Accord with a cracked passenger mirror. She had approximately $4,000 in a personal checking account. She had been divorced for 11 days. And according to the document in her hands, she was now one of the wealthiest private individuals in the American South. Dennis Mitchell heard about the inheritance within 48 hours. Carol was still in Atlanta when the call came. She was sitting in her hotel room trying to eat a meal she had ordered from room service and had not touched, staring at a document that listed the addresses of over 340 properties currently held in trust for her benefit. Her phone buzzed and she looked at the screen and saw Dennis's name and felt the particular sensation of a past that refuses to stay where you left it. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Dennis was not cruel. He was not shouting. He was measured and careful in the way that people are when they know they are being measured and careful. He said he felt there were things that needed to be discussed. He said he had spoken to an attorney, not Brian, a different one, a litigator based in Columbus whose name Carol did not recognize. He said that the inheritance had been received within the window of their legal marriage, that the divorce decree had been signed only after Raymond's death, and that under Ohio's marital property statutes, there were questions worth exploring. He said he thought they could handle it reasonably, between themselves, without it becoming adversarial. Carol sat on the edge of her hotel bed and listened to her ex-husband explain, in the careful language of a man who had recently hired a litigator, why he believed he was entitled to a portion of $750 million that she had not known existed a week ago. She said very little. She thanked him for calling. She hung up the phone, sat quietly for a long moment, and then she called Brian and told him they needed a second attorney. Brian agreed immediately. He said he already knew someone. He said he was going to be honest. This was significantly beyond his area of practice, and Carol deserved someone who had handled estates of this complexity before. He said he had already reached out to a woman named Diane Carroll, an estate litigator based in Atlanta whose reputation in this particular area of law was, in Brian's understated assessment, exceptional. Carol said fine. She said whatever it takes. She looked out the window of her hotel room at the Atlanta skyline, the city her father had spent 40 years working in without ever once inviting her to visit, and she said it quietly to herself again, whatever it takes. Within 2 weeks of the will reading, Carol was fighting on 3 separate fronts simultaneously. The first was Dennis's attorney's formal filing in Ohio, arguing that the inheritance constituted a marital asset on the grounds that it had been received, or at least initiated, during the period of their legal marriage. The argument hinged on precise timing. The divorce decree had been finalized on a Tuesday. Raymond Price had died on the Friday before that. His estate plan had been formally transferred to Carol's name the following Thursday. Dennis's legal team argued that the inheritance was received during an active marriage. Diane Carroll's response was swift and methodical. Raymond Price had designated Carol as sole beneficiary in a will drafted and executed years before the marriage to Dennis had even begun. This was not a gift received during a marriage. This was a right that had existed before the marriage and would have existed after it, regardless of when Dennis had finally decided he wanted out. The second front was Marcus Price's formal challenge to the will itself, filed in the Fulton County Probate Court in Atlanta within 10 days of the reading. Marcus's legal team argued diminished capacity, that Raymond, in the final year of his life, had exhibited signs of cognitive decline that cast doubt on whether the final version of his will reflected his true intentions. They had a physician willing to testify. They had documentation from a hospital visit 8 months before Raymond's death. They had emails between Raymond and his accountant that they argued showed confused thinking on several financial matters. What they did not have, and what Diane Carroll's team knew they did not have, was the video. The third front was quieter and stranger and in many ways more unsettling than either of the others. A journalist at a mid-sized Atlanta business publication had gotten wind of the story and had started making calls. And some of those calls had reached people who had known Raymond Price a long time, people who remembered a business partnership in the early years that had ended in a way not everyone had considered entirely fair. The story broke on a Thursday morning under a headline that Carol read on her phone while sitting in Diane Carroll's office waiting for a strategy meeting to begin. The headline read, "Divorced Ohio teacher inherits $750M Southern real estate empire." And the fights have already started. Within 24 hours, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. Within 48 hours, Carol's name was appearing in social media posts and morning show discussions and comment sections that she tried hard not to read but occasionally couldn't help herself. The coverage fractured predictably along the lines of what people wanted the story to mean. Some called it the ultimate second act. Some called it proof that women should never sign away their assets in a divorce without waiting to see what comes next. Some called it suspicious. Some called it fate. One woman on a morning television program in New York said it made her want to call her own estranged father, just in case. Carol, watching a clip of this on her phone in a borrowed Atlanta apartment she had rented for the duration of the proceedings, felt something she could not quite name. It was not recognized exactly. It was something closer to the strange vertigo of watching your own life become a parable before you have even finished living it. But while the public discussion focused on the drama of the divorce and the inheritance and the legal battles, one journalist, a careful, experienced reporter named Stephen Adler at the Atlanta Business Chronicle, was asking different questions. He was not interested in the divorce. He was interested in the empire itself. He was interested in how Raymond Price had built it. He was interested in the early years, the partnerships, the deals that had established the foundation of everything that came after. And he had found, in the public property records and corporate filings that his researcher had spent 2 weeks combing through, a name that appeared prominently in Raymond Price's earliest business documents and then simply stopped appearing, completely. as if the person had been edited out of the story. The name was Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch had been Raymond Price's business partner from the very beginning. The two men had met in their late 20s working in commercial property management for the same Atlanta firm, and they had recognized in each other the same hunger, the same instinct for opportunity, the same willingness to work ungodly hours toward a shared vision of what they could build. They had left the firm together in 1981 and founded what they initially called Price Fitch Properties, a small but ambitious real estate investment company with 2 employees, a rented office, and a business plan they had written by hand over the course of a long weekend. The early years were genuinely hard. They survived setbacks that would have ended lesser partnerships. They bought their first commercial building in 1983 and their first apartment complex in 1985, and by the late 1980s, they were acquiring properties at a pace that was beginning to attract attention from people with considerably more capital than either of them had started with. And then, in 1998, Gerald Fitch's name stopped appearing in any document connected to Raymond Price or Price Development Holdings, or any of its affiliated entities. The corporate records showed a buyout, a settlement agreement through which Gerald Fitch had transferred his stake in the partnership back to Raymond Price in exchange for a cash payment. The payment, as Stephen Adler's researcher eventually found in the court records of a related civil matter, had been $400,000. In 1998, for a stake that independent real estate analysts looking at the portfolio's value at that point estimated was worth somewhere in the range of $35 to $40 million. Gerald Fitch had been bought out for approximately 1% of what his share was worth. And the settlement agreement he had signed contained a comprehensive confidentiality clause. Gerald Fitch had been a 41-year-old man in 1998 with a wife, a 12-year-old daughter, significant personal debts from a failed side venture, and no legal team anywhere near the caliber of Raymond Price's. He had signed the settlement. He had taken the money. He had walked away from the partnership he had helped build from nothing and had spent the next 20 years, until his death in 2019, working a series of mid-level property management jobs that were a quiet, daily reminder of what he had once almost had. His daughter, a woman now in her mid-30s named Jennifer, had grown up knowing the outline of what happened. She had never forgotten it. And after the story broke about Carol's inheritance, she retained an attorney within the week. While the lawyers filed their motions and the journalists wrote their stories, and the social media comment sections debated the moral complexities of the situation from every conceivable angle, Carol Mitchell was doing something quieter. She was learning from her father. Not the father she had waited for as a child, not the ghost of absence that had shaped so much of her interior life. She was learning the man who had spent 40 years building something remarkable and had decided at the very end that it belonged to her. She was going to the properties, not the ones in Charlotte or Nashville or Texas, not yet. The Atlanta ones first. She would ask to be taken to a building, and she would walk through it slowly and try to understand how a mind worked that could look at a piece of land and see what it might one day become. She stood in the lobby of a glass and steel office tower on Peachtree Street that Raymond had purchased in 1993 and held for 30 years, and ran her fingers along the marble reception desk and tried to feel something she could name. She stood in the parking lot of an apartment complex in a southwest Atlanta neighborhood that Raymond had acquired in 1989 when no one else was paying attention, and that was now surrounded by new development and had tripled in value. And she thought about the people who had lived there over 3 decades. The ordinary lives conducted inside the buildings of an empire assembled in silence by a man who was too afraid, or too private, or too wounded. She was still deciding which, to simply call his daughter. She hired Diane Carroll to manage the legal battles. She flew back to Dayton once to collect more of her things and told her principal she would be taking personal leave. She enrolled in an accelerated business course at an Atlanta continuing education program because she was going to understand what she had inherited even if it took her years. She was 43 years old, and she had been a middle school English teacher in Ohio her whole adult life, and she had approximately zero background in commercial real estate. And she understood none of that was an excuse for being unprepared for the responsibility she had been handed. 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, a document surfaced that sent every attorney in every case scrambling. It was a handwritten letter, 3 pages, on plain white stationery, in Raymond Price's unmistakable handwriting. Marcus Price's legal team produced it. They had found it, they said, among Raymond's personal papers, papers that had been in the family home rather than with the attorney. The letter was addressed to no one specific. It spoke, in language that was personal and unguarded in a way Raymond's legal documents never were, about his wishes for the estate. And in 2 paragraphs near the middle of the second page, Raymond expressed a wish, not a legal directive, but a clear and apparently heartfelt wish, that his estate be divided in a way that acknowledged Marcus's contribution to the family business over the years. Marcus's legal team presented the letter as evidence of Raymond's true final intentions and argued that the formal will did not fully capture them. The room shifted. Carol's team shifted. For approximately 10 days, the letter created genuine uncertainty about where the case was heading. And then Diane Carroll brought in a forensic document analyst. The analyst examined the letter, the ink composition, the paper aging, the fold patterns, the pen pressure, the handwriting characteristics against verified samples of Raymond's writing at different points in his life. The letter was genuine. Raymond Price had written it. But when the analyst completed the dating analysis, the results showed the letter had been written not in Raymond's final months, not in any period close to the time of the final will, but approximately 3 years before the will had been changed to its final version. The letter was not a contradiction of Raymond's last wishes. It was a document from an earlier period of his thinking, a period during which, the timeline suggested, something had happened that had changed his mind about Marcus entirely, something that Raymond had chosen to address through a revised will rather than a conversation, something that no one in that conference room, at least not yet, was able to fully explain. Diane Carroll's team spent the following 3 weeks investigating what had changed between the date of the letter and the date of the final will revision. What they found was not a single dramatic event. It was a pattern. Marcus Price, through his own property management company, had over a period of several years been directing certain maintenance contracts and vendor relationships toward companies in which he had undisclosed financial interests. The amounts were not catastrophic relative to the scale of Raymond's empire, but they were consistent and deliberate, and they constituted, in the view of Raymond's accountants, who had eventually flagged the pattern, a systematic exploitation of Marcus's position within his father's business network. Raymond had confronted Marcus privately. Marcus had denied wrongdoing. Raymond had conducted his own quiet investigation. The same thoroughness and patience that had built the empire applied now to protecting it, and had arrived at conclusions that had apparently ended any remaining question about the direction of his estate plan. He had revised the will. He had not told Marcus why, and he had gone to his attorney's office 18 months before his death and recorded a video. Scene 18, 6066. The video Carroll's legal team brought the video to the will contest trial on its 4th day. Raymond Price had recorded it in his own office, not a formal setting, not a legal proceeding. Just a man and a camera and 47 minutes of total clarity. He spoke without notes. He named every property in the portfolio by address, by acquisition date, by current valuation. He described the corporate structure of Price Development Holdings in detail that made his estate attorney, who was present during the recording, later describe it as the most comprehensive oral inventory she had ever witnessed in 30 years of estate practice. He described his estate plan and his reasons for it with the patience of a man who had anticipated every argument that might be made against it and had chosen to preemptively answer each one. He spoke about Marcus. He spoke about the pattern of conduct he had discovered and the conclusion he had reached. He spoke without anger, with something that sounded more like a grief that had been processed until it became manageable. And then, in the final 2 minutes of the recording, he turned toward the camera and spoke to Carol directly. He said her name. He said he knew what people would say after he was gone, that he hadn't been present, that he had prioritized the business over the relationship, that his choices about distance had been selfish rather than protective. He said some of that was true. He said the fuller truth was more complicated than any version that fit neatly into the space of an accusation. He said he had made a decision when Carol was very young, in consultation with her mother, to stay at a distance that had cost him more than anyone would ever know. He said he had told himself it was for her protection from a world he was still building, and was not yet sure he could make safe. He said he understood if she could not accept that as sufficient. He said he had tried, through the only means he trusted, to make it right. And then he said, and the courtroom was completely silent when the attorney read this portion of the transcript into the record, he said that he hoped Carol would know that every building in the portfolio, every piece of land, every carefully structured entity had been, on some level, his way of building something worthy of her, something that would last, something that said what he had never found the words to say out loud while he was alive. The judge upheld the will. The estate in its entirety passed to Carol Ann Mitchell. The diminished capacity argument was dismissed as unsupported by the weight of the evidence. The video alone was considered by the court to represent compelling documentation of a mind that was, at the time of the final will's execution, fully and demonstrably clear. Marcus's team indicated they would explore appeal options, but the consensus among legal observers was that the foundation of the challenge had been dismantled completely. Dennis Mitchell's Ohio case had already collapsed 3 weeks earlier, when Diane Carroll's team successfully argued that the beneficiary designation predated the marriage, removing the inheritance entirely from the category of marital property. Dennis's attorney had released a statement noting his client was reassessing his options. Diane Carroll had released one sentence in response, which said the matter was resolved. Nothing further was required. Carroll walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in February. Almost exactly 1 year to the date from the morning she had walked out of the Dayton courthouse with her manila folder into an Atlanta afternoon that was warmer than it had any right to be for February and felt the full, overwhelming weight of where she was. She had spent the past year fighting for something she had not known existed. She had spent the past year learning a man she had never fully known. She had spent the past year becoming someone she had not yet fully identified. She stood on the courthouse steps with Diane Carroll beside her, and the city spread out ahead of her, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and stranger and more durable than triumph. She felt like a woman who had finally been allowed to arrive somewhere she had been traveling toward for a very long time without a map. 3 weeks after the verdict, Carroll asked Diane Carroll to arrange a meeting with Jennifer Fitch. Diane Carroll had advised against it from a legal standpoint. The statute of limitations on any claim Jennifer might have brought against the estate had almost certainly run out, and engaging with her directly created risk without corresponding legal benefit. Carroll acknowledged the advice. She said she wanted to have the meeting anyway. Jennifer Fitch was 37 years old and worked in commercial property management in Atlanta, a career path that people who knew her father's history found quietly devastating in its symmetry. She was direct and contained and arrived at the coffee shop Carroll had suggested with the wariness of someone who had been disappointed enough times by circumstances to keep her expectations well managed. Carroll arrived without attorneys. She ordered coffee. She told Jennifer that she had read Stephen Adler's reporting on the Fitch partnership. She told Jennifer that she had access to the internal documents now, the actual settlement records, the independent valuations of Gerald Fitch's stake, the timeline of how the buyout had been structured. She told Jennifer that she could not undo what Raymond Price had done, and that she was not in a position to know with certainty what his full motivations had been. She told Jennifer that she had spent a year learning about her father, and had come to understand that he was both more complicated and, in certain respects, more culpable than she had initially wanted to believe. And then she made an offer. Not because she was legally required to, not because Diane Carroll had suggested it, because Carol Mitchell had spent her entire career teaching 12-year-olds that the way you treat the most complicated situations reveals who you actually are. And she was not willing to become the owner of a $750 million empire without first deciding what kind of person was going to run it. The two women sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours. By the end of the conversation, both of them had cried. Neither of them could fully explain afterward exactly what the tears were for. They were for fathers, probably. For the way men like Raymond Price and Gerald Fitch had moved through the world, taking up enormous space and leaving enormous damage without ever quite meaning to, in the way you mean the things that do the most harm. They were for daughters who spend their whole lives in the undertow of choices made before they were old enough to understand what was happening. They were perhaps for the particular relief of sitting across from someone who has every reason to see you as the enemy and choosing instead to see each other as people. 18 months after the verdict, Carol Mitchell was no longer a middle school English teacher from Dayton, Ohio. She was the principal officer of the Raymond Allen Price Foundation, a newly established nonprofit entity through which she had restructured a portion of the estate's income-producing properties toward a mission focused on affordable housing development across the American South. She had partnered with city governments in 4 states. She had retained most of Raymond's longtime property management team, the people who had known the portfolio for decades, and had added her own hires, people she had chosen for their values as much as their credentials. She had sold the Honda Accord. She had moved permanently to Atlanta. She had gotten Chester the cat a companion, a second cat she named Raymond, which she acknowledged to friends was complicated and also felt exactly right. She had not become someone unrecognizable. That is the part of this story that the people who knew her before found most striking. She was still direct and warm and slightly impatient with pretension and deeply loyal to the people she trusted. She still brought food to meetings. She still stayed too late at the office because she was genuinely interested in the work. The scale of the world she was operating in had changed completely. The person operating in it had not changed nearly as much as anyone might have expected, which was, perhaps, the quality Raymond Price had seen in her from a distance for 40 years and had ultimately trusted above every other consideration when he sat down in front of that camera and tried to say everything he had failed to say while he was alive. Dennis Mitchell had moved to Florida. He had remarried. His attorney had not made further contact. Whether he thought about any of this, Carol neither knew nor spent much time wondering. Marcus Price had withdrawn his appeal. He had retained his interest in his own property management company, which operated independently of the Price Development Holdings portfolio. Carol had no contact with him. Patricia had sent a card, a surprising and oddly moving gesture, after the verdict. It said simply that she hoped Carol would take care of what Raymond had built. Carol had written back that she intended to. And Jennifer Fitch had accepted the settlement Carol offered, a settlement that Diane Carroll had helped structure carefully, and that Jennifer's attorney had reviewed thoroughly and found both fair and, in the words of his formal correspondence, remarkably generous given the legal circumstances. Jennifer had used a portion of the settlement to start her own real estate consulting firm. The two women still spoke occasionally, not often, but enough, the way people speak when they have survived something together that could have been far worse and have chosen not to forget that. People ask Carol Mitchell sometimes, in interviews she gives rarely, in conversations she has more willingly, whether she thinks the timing was a coincidence. She thinks Raymond Price somehow knew, from wherever fathers go when they leave, that she would need the inheritance most when she had nothing else. She does not answer that question the same way twice. Sometimes she says she thinks Raymond was simply a man who ran out of time to do in person what he finally did on paper. Sometimes she says she thinks the universe occasionally gets the timing right in ways that feel too precise to be accidental. Sometimes she says she doesn't know. What she always says, every version of the answer includes this, is that she thinks the 7 days matter, that the interval between losing everything and receiving everything was not incidental, that she needed to stand on that courthouse sidewalk in Dayton with nothing in her hands before she could have any idea how to hold what came next. That you cannot receive something of that size without first being emptied of the smaller version of your life you had been carrying. There are women watching this right now who are in the middle of chapters that feel like endings. Women who signed something they wish they hadn't. Women who walked away from something because staying was costing them more than leaving. Women who are standing in the middle of their own particular February and cannot see any further ahead than the next step. This story is not a promise that a $750 million inheritance is waiting for any of you. That would be absurd, and Carol Mitchell would be the first to say so. What this story is, what Raymond Price's complicated, private, quietly extraordinary life and death ultimately produced, is a single piece of evidence that the ending you imagine for yourself at your lowest point is almost never the actual ending. That the door you think is closing is sometimes the same door the real story walks in through, and that the inheritance worth fighting for is not always the one that shows up in a will. Carol Mitchell told me one last thing before we finished talking. She was standing at the window of her Atlanta office, which looks out over a city her father spent 40 years working in, and which she is now, in her own way, rebuilding. She said, "Tell them it was not a fairy tale. Tell them it was hard and strange, and there were months when she cried in parking garages and ate dinner alone, and genuinely did not know who she was becoming or whether she trusted the person she was starting to see in the mirror. Tell them it cost her relationships she had expected to keep and required her to make decisions she was not sure were right and forced her to sit with things about her father that she would have preferred not to know. Tell them the money is real and the complications are real and the grief underneath all of it is real. And then tell them that on a Tuesday morning in February, a woman walked out of a courthouse in Dayton with nothing in her hands, and that on a Thursday afternoon in Atlanta 1 year later, she walked out of a different courthouse with something that no document could fully contain, or any dollar figure fully describe. She walked out knowing exactly who she was. Tell them that is what the inheritance actually was. Tell them that was the thing that took 43 years to arrive. Before we close out today, we want to ask you something directly, because this is the kind of story that deserves more than just a like and a scroll past. We want to know, Have you ever had a moment in your life where losing something turned out to be the very thing that led you to what you were actually supposed to have? Have you ever signed away something or walked away from something or let go of something and found out later that it was the only path to where you needed to be? Drop that story in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved you at all, if any part of Carol's journey felt familiar, felt true, felt like something you needed to hear today, please share it with someone. Not because we need the numbers, but because there is someone in your life right now who is sitting in their own February morning wondering whether the story is over. And this video might be the thing that reminds them it is not. If you have not yet subscribed, please do it now. Hit that bell notification so you are here when the next story drops. Because the next one, the story of a man, Marcus, in Columbus, Ohio, who was betrayed by his wife, that story is going to make everything you just watched feel like a warm-up. Take care of yourself.